Good afternoon. Shalom. It's quite a pleasure to be here, and I want to sincerely thank the Israel Innovation Authority for asking me to join your discussion today. It's been just a series of excellent conversations. I want to thank the authority as well for rescuing me from what is a terrible snowstorm that is happening right now in Boston. So I'm very happy to be here and not in Boston. For quite some time now, I think that you here in Israel and those of us in Massachusetts have been asking ourselves some very similar questions. How can we evolve from these very, very strong R&D and startup hubs in the life sciences to scale up and smart up and real commercialized centers for innovation in the life sciences, so that the life sciences become a more important part in helping us diversify our economies and also are even greater contributors to economic growth. And since we've been asking ourselves some very similar questions, I thought that I would talk this afternoon about three things. The first is, how did we structure our efforts in Massachusetts to try and make this transformation? And where were the investments targeted? So what was the strategy? I think always when we start something like this, when we start an evolution or a transformation, we're tempted to begin with a lot of activities and to think about what we're trying to accomplish, the results that we want. We really tried in Massachusetts to step back first and say, what were we really trying to accomplish? Just a little bit of information on whether or not it has made an impact, and then I think most importantly, what have we learned, and just a few examples. So what is the Life Sciences Initiative? This is how we refer to our effort in Massachusetts to make that transformation from a very strong academic hub in the life sciences to a real center for innovation. This was an initiative that was envisioned by Governor Deval Patrick, who was the governor of Massachusetts from starting in 2007. And it was initially envisioned to be a 10-year initiative that was capitalized at $1 billion US, so about $100 million USD a year. Fortunately, as the initiative was ending its 10 years, the current governor of Massachusetts looked at the data on the impact and spoke with the life sciences community and decided that it was really worth continuing the initiative. So it is now a 15-year initiative capitalized at about $1.5 billion. The initiative is overseen by an entity that was created solely for this purpose, which is called the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center. And it is a quasi-public independent authority, which means it is funded by the state government of Massachusetts, but it is governed by a board of directors. It has quite a bit of flexibility. And all of the resources and the authorities and the responsibilities now that affect life sciences in Massachusetts are overseen by the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center. So the Life Sciences Center not only funds innovation, but it has a portfolio of new tools and techniques. So it is innovating new ways in which the public sector can really work with and support the private sector through the process of innovation, and also unique models of collaboration, so that we are really trying to be a partner to the private sector as opposed to, in some cases, an opponent of the private sector. This initiative is defined broadly in Massachusetts. You can see the different sectors of the life sciences that are included. And also it is defined broadly in terms of the workforce that we cared about. And that's because we really did not in any way want to think of the life sciences as siloed sectors. As you heard earlier in the presentations today, some of the most cutting-edge work, some of the greatest innovations and breakthroughs are occurring where these sectors overlap, where they intersect. So the convergence technologies, advanced therapeutics, for example, and also these types of personnel are needed, because when we're really talking about innovation, we're talking about commercialization. We're not just talking about science talent. We're talking about operating talent, the skills that you need to run a business. So the Life Sciences Center is simply the hub for our life sciences community in Massachusetts. We support all of the stakeholders. We are involved in a range of activities that go from funding to convening to marketing. So we're a one-stop shop, if you will, for the funding, the tools, the programs, access into our ecosystem, and sector expertise. So in a nutshell, that's the Life Sciences Initiative. How have we thought about our work? The strategy on which our work at the Life Sciences Center has been built draws on a concept that was developed by economists who study innovation. And they came up with a term that's called innovation capacity. And innovation capacity is the ability to produce and commercialize a flow of innovative technologies, products, and services over the long term. In other words, over and over again. It is a competency. It is a skill. We don't do it a few times by luck. We don't do it a few times. We're not sure why it happened. It is really a competency. It is a capacity that we have. And because we know that life sciences innovation, and indeed all innovation, is a process, and it goes through very defined steps. It has a life cycle: creation or discovery, development, growth, and sustainability. And while some sectors, such as devices or certainly IT, may spend a bit less time in these different stages of the life cycle, this is the life cycle. And supporting that life cycle is what I call a platform. Are all of the conditions that are there to really enable the process of innovation to run its course, to move from discovery all the way through to commercialization. Often we have a tendency when we think about innovation to focus on R&D and startup. We tend to think about the very early stages of that life cycle. And we forget about what is necessary to support the development and commercialization and growth and sustainability. What happens if we ignore these other needs, or enablers as we call them, is a few things. We may never actually embark on innovation. We may have a lot of invention, a lot of good ideas. We may simply export knowledge or IP. We may start companies, but our companies can't scale because we don't have enough of the enablers for growth. We may have lots of startup companies, and they may leave. We may end up being a net exporter of startup companies because the companies or the investors in those companies move the companies to where they can find the elements that are needed to support growth and scale up. So the strategy in Massachusetts has been to build a strong platform that supports the entire life cycle of innovation, and to start the process by looking at where we had major gaps and to invest in closing those gaps. What we know from research on geographies that have high innovation capacity is that they are actively commercializing their investments in science. The very simple analysis that PricewaterhouseCoopers does in their Money Tree report, and they look at how much money flows into states in the U.S. from the National Institutes of Health, which, as you know, is our big national funder of healthcare research, and there are other funders to be sure. And then PricewaterhouseCoopers looks at how much venture money flowed into a state in that same period of time, recognizing that research is multi-year, so these don't match perfectly year to year. But the point being that, as you can see, even in the US, we are not doing such a great job of leveraging our national investments in science. New York, which receives the third highest amount of money every year from the National Institutes of Health that goes into their research institutions, really only sees about 12 cents on the dollar. Whereas in Massachusetts and in California, and this is a big change for us in Massachusetts, we are now actually having a ratio where it is more than a dollar for a dollar. And the implications of this are actually significant. When we look at New York, which again is one of our very top geographies in terms of research and the development of intellectual property, but much of which is not commercialized there, KPMG did an analysis and projected that if New York was really commercializing its science on a rate that was on par with its investment in science, we're talking about 18 to 25,000 additional jobs and somewhere between 2 and 3 billion US dollars of additional economic growth. So suboptimizing on innovation capacity absolutely has opportunity costs. So how do we build innovation capacity? Obviously, there are a lot of factors. There are a lot of different types of investments. But if you simplify all of the activities, they fall into just 5 categories. The first is, what is the academic research culture in a geography? What is the balance between applied research and basic science? Is there an interest on the part of our academics? And certainly as we talk about pharmaceuticals and biologics, much of that IP comes out of our research labs and academic institutions. So do we have academic institutions that see themselves as part of the engine for innovation and startup activity? The second group, or enabler, if you will, is, do we really have an entrepreneurial culture? Certainly we have that in Israel. We have developed it in Massachusetts. And do we have capital that is willing to take risk, or we call it risk capital? The third enabler are factors that concern the workforce. And as I said earlier, if we're really talking about innovation, if we're talking about growth and commercialization, we're not just talking about science talent. We're talking about operating talent. We're talking about individuals who know how to grow companies, who know how to raise money, who know how to handle the logistics within companies. So we're really talking about a different kind of talent than we often think about as being associated with innovation. And yet the lack of this talent can be a huge barrier to the ability of startup companies to scale up. And it is one of the most common reasons that investors in startup companies will move them geographically, because they do not see the talent base to grow the companies and deliver a good return on the investment. Fourth is enabling infrastructure. Do we have spaces for young companies to grow? Incubating spaces, growth spaces, which are very different, accelerating spaces, co-working spaces, convening spaces. I mean, do we really have the infrastructure? Do we have cutting-edge labs, dry labs, wet labs that enable the work to go on that supports innovation in the life sciences? And also where the workforce can be trained. And then finally, but this is perhaps the most important, is there an ecosystem? Very often we use the term ecosystem, but what we really have is a cluster. A cluster, it refers to your assets. We have strong hospitals, we have strong universities, we have some large companies, we have other building blocks. I always like to say, if you are simply counting, you have a cluster. An ecosystem is when the members of the cluster work not just well individually, but they work together. This is where you really get the leverage. This is where you get the community that really pushes forward innovation, pushes forward startup companies. So again, do we have an ecosystem or do we have a cluster? Do we have a well-coalesced community that sees itself working together? And there are enablers of creating an ecosystem. I won't go through all of them, but you can see here that they include having a shared aspiration and vision, that there are advisory and mentoring resources that participate in that ecosystem, that there is a message, there is a calling card, there is a brand, if you will, that everyone sees themselves as being part of, that there are incentives to be part of the ecosystem, and that there is alignment of the stakeholders on the core competencies and the value proposition. Why weren't we getting traction in Massachusetts? Everyone says, oh, but you had Harvard, you had MIT, you had Mass General Hospital, you had wonderful scientific talent. Why weren't you an innovation hub? And when we looked at ourselves in 2008 using this framework, we discovered that we really did not have a strong translational research culture. We did not really have a culture of entrepreneurship, and we did not have early stage risk capital. We didn't have many growth spaces for companies. We didn't have incentives for companies to grow in Massachusetts. And most importantly, we did not have an ecosystem. I heard someone say the other day there was an ecosystem and there's an ego system. We had an ego system in Massachusetts. And people would say about Massachusetts, so many smart people who just don't play well together. And we had to work on this, and this, I think, was something that the Life Sciences Initiative very much focused on. In fact, I would say that of our investments, only 20 to 25% went to R&D. 75% of our investments went to workforce development, infrastructure, and building that ecosystem, using financial incentives, using investments in infrastructure to coalesce the community until it became just second nature. That was the new culture. So I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but I want to simply show you that the way that we went about this work over a series of years, as you can tell now, we're 10 years, almost 11 years into this initiative, required a portfolio of investments, because as I just showed you where we had gaps in these key enablers, there was no way that a single investment or a single focus was really going to make a difference for us. We could not build out the entire platform. So we made some investments in translational research. There actually were things that we as the public sector could do to help evolve the culture in our universities. We made investments in entrepreneurship, incentives to start companies, directly funding young companies, supporting coaching and mentoring. We made investments in workforce development, starting with our children in Massachusetts. The Life Sciences Center has put quite a lot of money into better enabling our schools to teach STEM through equipment, supplies, new types of curriculum, all the way through to our colleges and our universities. And I think one of our most popular programs is an internship program whereby students are paid by the Life Sciences Center, and they go and they work in startup companies. So they learn about entrepreneurship. They begin to understand how you build a young company. They become interested in entrepreneurship, and the entrepreneurs have access to different skill sets, and we pay for students to go for a year to work in startup companies. We invested in the ecosystem, and we invested in infrastructure. So again, We did not do all of this at one time, but the point is that it takes a portfolio of investments because we're really talking about building a platform that supports innovation from start to finish. Very quickly, we talk about this talent pool. So when I left the center in 2015, we had funded about 3,000 interns. They all went to startup companies. Companies could select as many as 4 interns, and many of those interns were hired as soon as they finished the internship. And as you can see, a variety of skill sets, the most popular being engineering. So very quickly, I'm not going to go through each one in detail, but you'll just see the variety of our investments. What is most important about our investments, and this was just through FY17, is the leverage on the investments. For every dollar that the Life Sciences Center invested, the private sector invested about $3. And so what we learned through our experience is the public sector can play a very important role in using its dollars as a magnet for private sector dollars, because if we're building the resources that the private sector needs, they will leverage those resources. They will begin to provide matching investment. And so at the Life Sciences Center, our model was not to provide a lot of operating funds. It was to provide capital to seed, to accelerate, and to provide leveraging opportunities for the private sector, be it industry or the venture community or academics or philanthropists. Very quickly, let me say a little bit about our impact. There's quite a lot of data that we have compiled, and especially through 2 independent evaluations of the impact of the Life Sciences Initiative. But I will share just a few. What we know in Massachusetts now at a national level is that Massachusetts has more jobs in the life sciences per capita than any other state in the US. And that surpasses California, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York. So some of those states certainly much larger than Massachusetts, but per capita. And we know that the earnings of the workforce in life sciences has been very, very strong. We know that Massachusetts has now been identified through independent evaluations as the best place in the US to start a company, which was not always the case. We know that we are now ahead of other universities around the country, with our universities being the source of startup activity. So many of the things that we had hoped would happen have happened. But what we know about the specific investments that we made, and especially looking at the young companies that we have supported, but I think more importantly because of the platform that we have built to support those companies, we know that relative to the industry in general in Massachusetts, the companies supported by the life sciences have had faster job growth, more patents, more IPOs. They have received more venture capital money and more federal grants. They have been responsible for an amazing number of clinical trials. So over a 7-year period, young companies, startup companies in Massachusetts were responsible for 435 clinical trials, 9% of all the clinical trials in Massachusetts. And when you think now of the number of very large biopharma companies, you see how much activity the startup community is generating now that we have enabled them to really move just from a startup company to companies that are really now moving very, very quickly towards commercialization. More collaborations between industry and academia, and the creation of other types of infrastructure such as research facilities, lab space, cutting-edge equipment and incubators. So the state has funded quite a large number of these, but we have been motivating to other organizations to fund these as well. And the pipeline of life sciences workers. I won't spend a lot of time on this, you can just see, but again, among the companies that were supported by the Life Sciences Center, they experienced about 50% growth versus 14% for startups as a whole. They averaged $61 million of VC investment per company versus an average of just about 40 million. And they received $2.1 billion in funding. So this is in an 8-year period. Many patents generated, much more success in receiving funding from our federal government. And the statistic that I gave you, 9% of all of the industry-led clinical trials coming from startup companies. And as I mentioned, we're very proud of the fact that we are now seen as the best place in the US to start a company. Let me share with you some of the key lessons and food for thought for you here in Israel. As I said, there's no magic bullet for accelerating innovation. Building innovation capacity requires a portfolio of investments. They have to be strategically targeted to gaps. They have to be coordinated to an overarching framework. I very often see a lot of excellent activity. It's like lots of gears spinning. But if you think about a car, those gears have to be connected or the car doesn't move forward. So there needs to be some overarching strategy that is organizing and connecting the investments. And they need to be based on a holistic approach. Avoid the temptation to do everything. There are a lot of very interesting things going on all around the world. It's very tempting to say, let's have one of these, let's have one of those, let's have one of those. But it's really important to identify and focus on and prioritize those activities and those investments that are going to make the greatest impact and really need to be strengthened here in Israel. Public sector investments should be highly leveraged. As I said earlier, our philosophy was SAM, seed, accelerate, and match. So the Life Sciences Center provides no operating funds. Our thought is if we are investing in the right things, if we are getting our companies to a certain point, they will attract subsequent capital. There will be sources that will support their operations and the operations of the centers that we have funded. And very often that has been industry and the academic institutions themselves. Avoid thinking of the innovation sectors as silos to build one by one. I really believe and agree with so much of what was discussed earlier about the fact that here in Israel you are so well poised to drive innovation, to lead in innovation in some of the most cutting-edge areas, which are the advanced therapeutics and the convergence therapies, which draw on not just life sciences, but ICT, that may draw on advanced manufacturing techniques. So I really think that this is where a lot of the cutting-edge work is going on, and I think that Israel is very well poised to take advantage of that by focusing, encouraging, and investing at the nexus, the points of intersection of different innovation sectors. Don't hesitate or don't fail to pay attention to funding and incentivizing new models of partnership and collaboration. This is very, very critical. This makes you more attractive to capital. It makes you more attractive to large companies who want to come and be part of a well-coalesced ecosystem. And our recommendation, our lesson is that funding from the bottom up as opposed to the top down works better for the innovation sectors. And by that I mean most governments have a model for top-down driven economic development, but we think that letting the life sciences community set the priorities, help identify the gaps, and then with government as a partner in addressing those is perhaps a better model. So why is the public sector critical in all of this? The public sector has the power to convene, to coalesce all of the key stakeholders into a collaborative and mutually reinforcing community, i.e. an ecosystem. There's what we call a bully pulpit that goes along with the government, which makes it a very strong convener. Usually if the government calls, people will answer the phone. The government invites to a meeting, people will come. The government also has the broad mandate to coordinate across innovation-related investments. Industry's major priority is on its own business strategy. Certainly industry is a great partner in things that enable its business strategy. That may be helping to invest in startups. It certainly is workforce, and it may be infrastructure. But in the main, the broad mandate to coordinate resources rests with the government. The government has the responsibility for enabling infrastructure, and certainly infrastructure that is shared and that benefits everyone, all members of the life sciences community. The public sector is also in a position to create resources that must be shared and can be leveraged to strengthen the entire innovation community. That is much more the role of the public sector to do. And finally, the public sector is in a very good position to market and promote and brand the entire ecosystem, to carry the message, to develop the calling card. Each individual institution, each company will certainly have its own brand and its own calling card. But when we talk about the region as a whole, when we talk about Israel as a whole, what do we want to be known for? The government best carries this message. So I'm going to give you just a very few examples of this public-private partnership in action, and then, of course, if time permits, would love to take some questions and have some discussion. So I talked about de-risking early-stage companies. And the Life Sciences Center actually offers several programs that are geared to de-risking companies. Some grants that are going to very, very early companies, step-out companies, if you will. Loans of, actually this should be up to $3 million for early-stage companies with the sole objective of bridging them to a Series A. If the company is not successful, we write down the loan. If the company raises a Series A round, we simply ask for to be repaid with 10%, but by that time the investor is repaying us, not the company. But the company has no obligation to even start thinking about repaying the loan until a 5-year term. But again, this is not intended to take a company all the way through development and to commercialization. It is intended to de-risk companies so that investors who want to put 20, 30, 40, 50, and more $1 million into the company are now looking at a company that has gone through proof of concept or proof of principle or has data that is necessary to make the case that this is worth investing in. Obviously, it's a risky process. It could still fail. But our goal is not to see the company all the way through. As I said, it is to make the company more attractive. And then by putting in place all of these other resources, our goal is then to help the company because it's in an environment, it's in an ecosystem, it has infrastructure that it needs, it can access workforce that's ready to come and work. And the mentoring program funds established programs and networks that provide mentoring support. And a newer program is called the Gen X program, which is targeted to women entrepreneurs. It's done together with Takeda. It's a 5-year commitment to help women-owned and start and led businesses access capital and get mentoring. So again, this is our, these are some of our programs. The public-private partnership in the venturing model is that industry and VCs participate in our fund. They can put money into our fund. They get no rights of first refusal. They get no equity. They get a look at this early stage technology, and very often they would like to mentor. They're now watching some of these companies. They refer companies to the Life Sciences Center. Angels will send companies. in which they may have invested. VCs will send companies that they think are interesting, but they're too early. So it becomes a collaborative effort to help support these companies. And we have a very multidisciplinary advisory panel, serial entrepreneurs, industry, academics who've started companies, VCs, who sit together and review the applications for funding to the Life Sciences Center and decide what is the relative best use of the investment dollars on behalf of the entire life sciences community. And as I mentioned, we now have a very active mentoring network where industry, VCs, academics, our business community, our patent lawyers, our financial experts are very willing to mentor and support the companies. And the Life Sciences Center facilitates introductions between startups and investors. I mentioned the Mass Gen program, so I won't speak further about that. All investment that the Life Sciences Center puts into early stage companies is non-dilutive. So we're not taking an equity position. Our goal is simply to help young companies be more competitive for subsequent funding. And quite a lot of our budget, as I said, has gone into creating shared infrastructure. This is just one example. It was a partnership between a number of our academic institutions. You can see them here, 2 of the large technology companies, and they stood up something called the Massachusetts Green High Performance Computing Center, which is a shared center that everyone can use. It has needs for high throughput computing. And the Life Sciences Center invested in a supercomputer system that was targeted to the needs of life sciences companies. Business accelerators, something else that the Life Sciences Center has helped to stand up. There's no reason that an individual company would want to invest in a co-working space. But once it was there, it has been used extensively by industry and by venture companies that buy what are called golden tickets from Lab Central. They really are simply sponsorship opportunities. And those golden tickets are used to support the companies that come and are working in Lab Central because they've been identified by these sponsors as very interesting companies. So again, we provided the initial investment, only $10 million US in seed funding, and I think at this point about $650 million have flowed through Lab Central, all coming from strategic and institutional investors. So though that's the end of my formal comments, if there's time, I'm very happy to take any. Is there time, Itai, for a few questions? Yeah. Okay. Yes. I'm going to come out of the lights a little bit so I can see.
It's 2 questions.
Yes.
The first is does your program have anything to do, or is it focused also on Y and Z generations, like the younger generations?
Absolutely. Yes. So the Life Science Center funds. Yes, I'm sorry. The question is, does the Life Sciences Center focus on the younger generation in terms of talent? And the answer is absolutely. The Life Sciences Center funds programs that start for children when they're preschool and then all the way through. So obviously preschool, many of these are community-based programs. But we have in Massachusetts a program called Science Club for Girls. We fund a lot of programs that are interested in getting girls and children of color interested in the life sciences. The demographics of the U.S. are changing, so obviously half of the population already is female. But we are really becoming, a much more diverse country. And as companies think about where they are going to get their talent, it is going to be more diverse talent. And so we are wanting to make sure that our schools in Massachusetts, especially schools in communities that teach very diverse children, and these are very often our economically challenged communities, have the funds that they need for equipment and supplies and the right kinds of curriculum. So we are funding our preschool children programs. We are funding our middle school children. We are funding students in high school, especially in our vocational and technical high schools. We've put money into building a few clean room training facilities. And then, of course, as we go up, academic institutions are able to come to the center for money for basic upgrades if they have very outdated labs, very outdated equipment. And then a number of our academic institutions will come with requests for these very, very cutting-edge types of centers. So a center for proteomics, a center for study of the microbiome, a study for personalized cancer therapies, study for the translation of research in diabetes. And while we may fund these centers and they may be located at an academic institution or at one of our hospitals, such as the zebrafish facility that we funded at Children's Hospital, because these are public dollars, they must be available to all academics, to industry, to the startup community, and so they become shared resources. They are for everyone's use, and they really begin to help coalesce that ecosystem, because if I'm a company and I'm coming very often to use your center, or if I teach at another academic institution and I'm coming very often to use your center, we begin to talk about how we might partner and collaborate. So yes, the answer is yes, yes, yes. Any other questions? Yes.
Sue, always I enjoy very much your lecture. They're fantastic. But I think really you show that actually in 11 years, or actually 10 years,
yes,
you turn things around completely and make it now to be really the center of the world of the biomed. And let's put it straightforward. That's the center of the world for biomed. Changed really past California, of course, past New York, long time ago. And actually you did it not with too much money. We talk about $100 million a year,
yes,
for such a thing. And this was the leverage for a lot of investment. So, and you actually point to all the critical points. What was the obstacle for the development? Like the first thing is to identify two obstacles and try to see how you can solve them. And you really solve them one by the other. I'm sure there are many more obstacles. We know it's a very risky
yes,
industry. We know that the success rate from the first time you inject an animal till a drug approved by the FDA is 1 promille only. That's about the rate.
that's right.
But if you make it, then it covers everything and still a lot of money left for further development.
Yes.
So
yes.
I think, first of all, thank you for your lecture, and there is a lot to learn from it. So my many years in this business, I can say that everything you said is absolutely true.
Thank you. And you were really saying many of these same things. I was very excited when I was listening to your participant. Yes, I had my headset, so I was hearing perfectly.
Sure.
Because as I said, we really only put about 25% of our money into R&D. The rest we put into workforce, infrastructure, ecosystem, so that even the young companies that we did not fund directly, we were creating a place where they could be successful. And I think that was probably even more important than some of that seed funding.
But you know what's the difference between us? Everyone listened to you, no one listened to me. That's the difference.
Well, they should listen to you. I very much agree with all the comments that you made earlier. I just think we don't think about the entire platform that supports innovation. And I think that is why we tend to concentrate our money towards the front end. And we lose the opportunity. I mean, I'm sure you know, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. We owe Israel a tremendous debt of gratitude, all of us around the world, because of the IP that is exported from Israel and the early stage companies that are exported from Israel. I don't think that's what you want. And so I think the real issue is to make sure that there is more of what is needed to get to scale up and Smartup here in Israel. Yes?
Over here. First of all, it was really very interesting, but if you want to apply your model to us, to Israel,
Yes.
there are at least two problems that I can think of. First of all, Israeli companies, the market in Israel is so small that we have to go outside. If you have a company, a startup in the US, you have the market in the US. You don't need to go anywhere. All we want to do is to come to you. So that's one problem. So how can you keep those startups here in Israel? And the other thing is the question of mentoring. You have a lot of large companies with many people with experience. And when we are looking for those mentors here in Israel, we don't have that many people.
Yes, yes.
Where do we get them?
Yes. So two answers to both of your questions, because they're very, very good questions. So the first is, let's remember that Massachusetts is not a market. It is a place where companies can start and can grow, but they still need to access the market as well. And our goal is, as they are commercializing and they're growing, we would still like them to choose to keep their base of operations, as much of it as possible, in Massachusetts. So I completely understand the need to access the market, but I'm not sure that I think that equates to the companies are leaving because they need access to the market. They can still be here and grow and scale and access the market. There's quite a lot of commerce and travel that goes back and forth between Israel and the rest of the world. Certainly you are not isolated. So again, I think we just need to distinguish between being in search of a market and being in search of the ingredients that companies need to grow themselves. The second is, you will probably be surprised to know that in 2007, the year before we began this initiative, one of the global leading biopharma companies was in Massachusetts, and that was Novartis. And Novartis had come to start its biomedical research lab. So they came only because of the research talent. By 2013, I'm going to say 14, 18 of the 20 largest biopharma companies had a significant footprint in Massachusetts. 12 of them have over 1,000 employees now. So it happened very quickly, and I think the point that is to be made is when the innovation model for large companies now is external discovery. It takes too long, it's too expensive. Most companies are not doing a lot of bench science that they are taking all the way through to commercialization. They are looking for those assets outside of their own company and for them to be somewhat de-risked and somewhat developed. So it is important for them to be in communities that have a very vibrant start and scale up community. If they're just startups and just IP, they can get away with visiting occasionally to see what's there. But if there really is a very strong ecosystem and that platform that's really supports all the way through to commercialization, then it becomes strategically important for them to be there. And I'll give you a great quote from Johnson & Johnson about why they came to I'll give you two good quotes, one from Amgen and one from Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson said, "We, the big companies, are whales. We must swim where there are minnows. So we have to be part of these. And companies will look around the world and say, this is a strategic priority for us to be here, to physically be here, and to have a real presence here, part of our operations here. At one point, someone asked Amgen, the president of Amgen, why has Amgen invested $100 million in Massachusetts over the last 5 or 6 years? And he said, because Massachusetts has created an environment where innovation can really happen. So I say all that to say that the secret to encouraging larger companies to come and have a significant presence is if they see that this really is a place where innovation, and I'm using the term broadly, not just discovery, that innovation is really taking place. It becomes important. And they bring many things that then further anchor the ecosystem. They provide some of that talent. Now, we had to attract some of the talent we had from other locations. We were growing some of the talent ourselves. But we see now many of the senior executives from big companies who like the idea of going to run a small company. So we see a lot of movement back and forth. I do think that in the short term, Israel will need a good strategy, though, for finding ways to attract some of that talent, even if it's to come and spend some time coaching and mentoring your young CEOs. And I think that given all of the very successful companies that are outside of Israel, it's time to reach out to them and see what it might take for some of those executives to come and spend some time and help develop that next generation. But again, what you see now in Massachusetts was not there, so it is possible. It is possible to develop it.
Okay, so tell me that we have to leave the... thank you very much.
Thank you very much.